Good morning, everyone. I'm happy to welcome you to yet another session of the NPTEL course titled Indian Fiction in English. As per the schedule, today we will be taking a look at a novel by Arun Joshi. It's titled The Strange Case of Billy Biswas. As some of you may already know, Arun Joshi is a well-known Indian writer in English. He was born in 1939 and died in 1993. He was the recipient of the Sahitya Academy Award in 1982. And we can say that he is in such a sense considered as one of the foremost writers as far as this field is concerned, and he is taught as an important writer in most of the courses related to Indian writing in English. He was born in Uttar Pradesh, but however most of his higher studies he completed his higher studies in the United States of America. He left for the US and took his degrees from Kansas University and Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He returned to India to work in Delhi. Initially, he was working as a management consultant, and then he also headed a research institute in Delhi. And this also gives us an indication that he had a very different kind of a career. His interests were varied and they were also quite unique, because he moved on to lead a very different kind of life. He left behind a lot of conventional things and went on to become a writer of a very different nature. And if you read up a little bit about his life and his works, we would also get to know that he led his life mostly as a recluse. Very little is known about his private life, and he also had very uncanny kind of unique characteristics, much to his credit. For example, he published only with Orient paperbacks, and this was the leading local publisher for a long time in India. But even after the entry of global publishing houses such as Penguin, it's rather strange and interesting that Arun Joshi continued to remain only with Orient paperbacks. Even today, we can find that his novels are still the editions and re-editions of the original Orient paperback publications. And if you recall, even writers such as Anita Desai, they began their career publishing with Orient paperbacks. This varied nature in his personality, the recluse soul that he was, and the kind of varied career that he had, we can find it getting reflected in much of his writings as well. If we go through some of his novels and characters, we'll get to know that alienation is an important aspect of most of Joshi's characters. And the kind of alienation that Arun Joshi talks about in his novels, they have a more universal trait. They cannot be reduced to Indian characters or Indian psyche alone. There's a certain universality which can be projected onto most of his novels and characters. And here I briefly draw your attention to two of his major works. The Foreigner, published in 1968. Incidentally, that was also his first major novel. And secondly, The Apprentice, a novel published in 1974. And in both these novels, we find characters, protagonists, who are caught in a certain hypocritic society. Left to themselves, they would love to be their ideal selves. They would love to be the perfect kind of citizens that modern India deserves. But however, we also find that their ideal selves are not able to live perfectly in this imperfect society. So we can even say that Joshi always had this unrest, this feeling of unrest within him, that he is also caught up within a certain hypocritic society where he is not able to live the ideal life that he would have loved. In this novel Foreigner, the protagonist is a person who is born in Kenya to an Indian father and an English mother. He is also orphaned at an early age. We will not go into the details of the novel, but there is an important aspect to which I want to draw your attention to. This protagonist, he considers the first 25 years of his life largely wasted in search of wrong things in wrong places. This is very typical of most of Joshi's characters and most of Joshi's plots. There are a set of characters who are caught in particular situations, and maybe we can sum up all of their lives to say that they were largely wasted in search of wrong things in wrong places. One may not always agree with the kind of definitions about the wrong places and the wrong things that these characters and protagonists were in search of, but nevertheless, what remains at the heart of Joshi's novels is that there are these characters who are caught in the post-independent nation, who are disillusioned with the many promises that the moment of independence made to the young nation, and the characters who are not able to retain the purity or the selfless ideals that they were initially quite enthralled about. The other novel, Apprentice, which was published in 1974, there is this character Ratan Rathore. He is a government official and he is also a very idealistic young man. But however, we also find that he is not able to live the life that he always wanted to. Rather, he is caught in the prevalent corruption in post-independence India. And here I also want you to remember that Joshi always draws attention to the many difficulties and the many challenges which were prevalent in post-independent India, especially in the 1950s, 60s and 1970s. And Ratan Rathore, the character, the protagonist in The Apprentice, he succumbs to the pressures of the society, the corrupt world around. He ends up accepting a bribe. He allows defective equipment to be supplied during the Indo-China War in 1962. So we will not be going to into further details of these works, but however, we find that if we take any of Joshi's novels, we find characters who are caught in these difficult situations, especially in the post-independence scenario. A Strange Case of Billy Biswas, the novel that we propose to discuss today, is no different. Published in 1971, this is considered as one of Joshi's best novels, and even till date, this is considered as one of the most read novels of Joshi, and also one of the most taught novels of Arun Joshi. And here we also find a certain autobiographical element being built into the plot of this piece of fiction. This is the story of a US returned Indian who is Bimal Biswas, and he is fondly referred to as Billy throughout the novel by his friends and relatives. And he has an obsession with Adivasi culture, the tribal culture in independent India. And this forms the heart of the novel. And a little bit of background into Billy Biswas is important to understand this kind of unique and strange obsessions that Billy's character has throughout. He was born in a middle class, fairly well-to-do family, and he was sent to US to study engineering, which was considered as a very prestigious and quite an accomplished thing then. And instead of pursuing engineering, he graduated in anthropology because that was what he wanted to do in the heart of his heart. And with this degree in anthropology, he returns to India. For a while, he settles down and he leads a very conventional, normal, domestic, middle class life. He returns to India. He gets married to a young woman of same family status. He also finds a teaching job in which he is not very happy, but however he continues in that, in the normal routine life for a while. But however, all throughout this, he finds the middle class Indian life unbearably superficial. And it is this hypocrisy of the middle class society, it is this redundancy of the middle class society that Billy Biswas always tries to break out of. In certain ways, we can even say that it is Arun Joshi himself who is always trying to break out of the redundancy and the superficiality of the middle class life that most Indians find themselves in. And Billy's life after that, it's quite tumultuous. It is extremely difficult for his family, and it is challenging in multiple ways to everyone who is associated with him. We find him meeting Bilasia, a tribal woman, during one of his anthropological field trips. He gets passionately involved with Bilasia, and he also disappears from civilized society to continue his life with the tribals. And he also is quite comfortable. He is quite at home when he is away from these modernized civilized society, and while he is living with the tribals. And again, we will not divulge more details about how the novel ends and what happens to Billy towards the end. Perhaps I leave it to you for you to read upon your own and figure out. And having said that, I want you to pay attention to the way in which the novel gets narrated. Billy Biswas is not the narrator of this novel. We have a different narrator who is Romi Sahai. He is an IAS officer in India, and he was also Billy's friend during his time in the US. So Romi is someone in that sense who was with Billy when he was undergoing this transformation, because until he was sent to US to study engineering, perhaps he himself had no clue that he would eventually shift to studying anthropology, and that his life will begin to take such a tumultuous and challenging turn. So Romi Sahai emerges as this perfect narrator who's in charge of all the events, and who also gets to know what happened in Billy's life while he was in the US, and also someone who's able to follow with these changes even after his return to Delhi. And the narrator and the protagonist in this novel, we find that there's a certain way in which they are placed in contrast with one another. On the one hand, we have Billy's passionate commitment to tribal culture, and on the other hand, there is this figure of Romi Sahai, who is the spokesperson for the more conventional perspectives. And Romi, in fact, is the kind which we would perhaps more relate ourselves also with. He is this perfect middle class, successful person who is well educated, who is into a successful career, who is leading a normal, peaceful family life. So he fits the bill in every sense. And Billy is the antithesis to what Romi is. And in this contrast, we can also find a certain way in which Billy's character begins to emerge. We also find that it is in this contrast that Joshi is able to build in a lot of narrative techniques, and also play with a lot of modernist techniques as well. When we talk about the themes which dominate Arun Joshi's A Strange Case of Billy Biswas, it's possible to say that at multiple levels it's about India. It's about post-independent India. The novel, the narration of the novel, the plot, the many details which are built into it, the character change that Billy Biswas undergoes throughout his life, all of these are dominated by an idea of a mystery of an essential India. And this is deeply antithetical to modern India. Here we find a certain kind of a continuation of the rhetoric of Orientalism being built in which perhaps indicates that Arun Joshi is a writer, a modern Indian citizen, who believes that there is a certain mystery, there is a certain essential India which has got lost in this race towards modernization. It would be rather naive to say that Arun Joshi is against modernization, or even Billy Biswas is against modernization. But what they are reacting to, what they are responding to, is the process through which a certain essential part of mystic India, an essential part of the mysteries of India, were lost in this entire process of building a modern nation. Whether we agree with this or not, we perhaps have to agree with some of the critics who have pointed out that in most of Joshi's novels, we find a concern to discover some notion of authentic being, whether it's an authentic India or an authentic person, or a sense of an authentic feeling or an authentic culture. We find that in Joshi's novels, the protagonists are always in this pursuit to discover some notion of an authentic being. Whether this is a real notion or not, that's a different thing altogether. Perhaps it is entirely a fictive thing that Joshi's characters are in search of. But nevertheless, Joshi and his characters, we find them always obsessed with and in pursuit of an authentic being which may or may not exist. It's also important to give you a certain sense of a background and context when we talk about the setting of this novel. Some of the critics have pointed out that Arun Joshi's A Strange Case of Billy Biswas is set in the tradition of the Verrier Elwin anthropological debate. Verrier was an Indian sociologist. He was a renowned academic as well. And in the post-independent period, when the nation and the administration had to take a decision about the issue of the tribals, the question of the tribals. There were two different kinds of camps, two different opinions about what to do with them, how to assimilate them into the mainstream, quote unquote mainstream, whether to assimilate them or not. So there were two distinct camps, and Courier, the Indian sociologist, he believed that the tribals should be mainstreamed. And based on his studies and based on his field work, he also had identified three different types of tribal groups. The first kind who do not want to change despite their interaction with non-tribal societies. They would rather retain all their primitive practices and all their indigenous practices, irrespective of the contact that they had begun to establish with non-tribal societies. And the second tribe would want to isolate themselves from non-tribal societies and minimize all kinds of interaction with the non-tribal societies. And there was a third kind which Courier thought would be in majority and was also much in favor of. The third kind was willing to assimilate with non-tribal societies. And in this sense, Courier also believed that the answer to the question of the tribals, it was in the process of mainstreaming the tribals into the civilized society. But there was this other group led by Verrier Elwin, and he argued, he called for maintaining a distinct identity, a tribal way of life, and leaving the tribals alone and not interfering with their lives or with their indigenous practices and not forcing them to assimilate with what we now call as mainstream. So this novel, we can say that it's set in the tradition of the Courier-Elwin anthropological debate. This was a famous debate which also had changed the character, changed the nature of the character of the studies related to the tribal societies in India. And here it's also important to recall that Verrier Elwin, he has a role to play in the history of Indian writing in English. Verrier Elwin was a British self-trained anthropologist, an ethnologist and a tribal activist. He first arrived in India as a missionary during the British colonial rule, and then he went through a series of changes during his life in India. He led a very eventful life in that sense. He abandoned clergy. He then worked with Gandhi and the Indian National Congress. He even lived in the ashram with Gandhi, and he also converted to Hinduism during this period. And eventually, over the question of the issue of over the issue of tribals, especially in the post-independent period, he split with Congress, and he also devoted the rest of his life to his work, to the anthropological work on the Indian tribals. He acquired Indian citizenship. His writings were well acclaimed, and his autobiography, The Tribal World of Verrier Elwin, it won the Sahitya Academy Award in 1965. So Verrier Elwin in that sense is very important to the history of Indian writing in English as well. So coming back to our discussion, this is a background and context which sets the tone for the setting in this particular novel. If some of you have already read the novel, and if you've been trying to locate some critical material on this novel, Strange Case of Billy Biswas, you will begin to see that there are different approaches to this novel, and most of them are limited to either eco-critical studies, and there are a number of critical material which also approaches this novel as a typical modernist work. And it would be possible to say that Arun Joshi is clearly one of the finest writers in the pre-Rushdian era. And this novel, A Strange Case of Billy Biswas, and there are some critics who are also of the opinion that Arun Joshi and most of his writings, they were overshadowed in the post-Rushdian period, because Rushdie was such a huge influence. Rushdie was such a trendsetter in the 1980s that it was impossible to go back and review some of the writers who had left a mark until the 1970s. So even when some of the writers such as Arun Joshi, they continued to write in the 1980s, their writings did not get much of an acknowledgement given the kind of huge influence that Rushdie had brought in already. And talking about the modernist elements in this novel, here I also recall this a fine story written by Virginia Woolf, a typical modernist writer. Her short story Solid Objects, it has got something quite similar in theme with that of Arun Joshi's A Strange Case of Billy Biswas. In Solid Objects, we have a protagonist who gives up a promising career in politics and he goes in search of solid objects, goes in search of rocks, pebbles, shiny stones and those sort of things, and this becomes his passion from then on, and he had given up on a very promising career in politics. And just like we mentioned in the beginning about Joshi's characters who are caught in the wrong places, pursuing the wrong things in life, yeah, here we also find Virginia Woolf's protagonist eventually identifying the one thing which is important in his life, that is acquiring solid objects. And from a very conventional point of view, it may appear as if this protagonist, he becomes insane towards the end. His friends forsake him because there is no way in which one could bring him back to normal life and tell him that you do have a career, you do have a promising life over here, get rid of these insane hobbies and come back to life. Perhaps in the same way, Joshi's characters, particularly Billy Biswas, he's also caught in this dilemma of having to choose something which the world, which the society thinks very promising. But in the heart of his heart, what perhaps catches his fancy, what perhaps he identifies as the sole object of his passion and his ambition is the life that he finds, the passion that he finds in his life with the tribals. Here we also need to clarify this aspect. Billy Biswas is not against modernity, and this is something that we need to make a distinct note of. At no point is Arun Joshi asking us to wage a battle against modernity. This is not a call to go into the primitive, the indigenous elements at the cost of giving up on everything related to modernity, because modernity, as we know, is also one of the finest things that happened in the 20th century. It's also something which introduced us to most of the things, most of the good things that we know of in today's world. And modernity, as we also know, it was the turning point. It was the crucial crucible within which even a set of writings such as these began to emerge. So in that sense, modernity was extremely important in defining and redefining the world from the 20th century onwards. So in that sense, this novel is not against modernity. Billy Biswas is not against modernity, but the fight, the discomfort, the annoyance and the alienation is against the pseudo-Western values. One may have multiple opinions about this, and we will not get into those debates. And one important thing, one very fine thing about Joshi's novel is that that the novel does not consider the tribals as being uncivilized. So contrary to the popular opinion, especially in the 1960s and 70s, about the tribals being away from the mainstream and hence not civilized enough to be assimilated or not civilized enough to be acknowledged, Arun Joshi's novel asks certain important questions about what civilization is, what modernity is, and what modernity does to the multiple and layered definitions of civilization. And in that sense, this novel is a trendsetter. It begins to ask a lot of uncomfortable questions. It also identifies, it also begins to acknowledge the tribal communities as a set of people with distinct practices and identities. And it is in this aspect that we find this novel beginning to challenge a number of accepted practices. But nevertheless, it also needs to be said that apart from the immediate success that it enjoyed, and apart from the kind of awards and accolades that Arun Joshi received, we do not find this novel being discussed much, especially in the post-Rushdie era. And the reasons for this again could be varied and multiple enough. And talking about the critical responses, regardless of the fact that Arun Joshi was a recipient of the Sahitya Akademi Award, and regardless of the fact that he continues to be rated as one of the finest writers that Indian writing has ever produced, this particular work, A Strange Case of Billy Biswas, it was considered as a failure, at least by some of the critics. And this was primarily due to the plot structure, that it did not give it was not attentive enough to the family's sufferings, because Billy, throughout we find the character of Billy being unable to establish a meaningful contact with his wife Meera and the society that she represents. So there's hardly anything that we get to know from the perspective of the family or from the perspective of Meera. At some level, when the novel continues to project Billy Biswas as the victim, we have a failure. We are unable to see what the family is going through. And the other thing is that this novel cannot be seen as entirely post-colonial. We mentioned at the beginning of this lecture that there's a certain kind of a continuation of the Orientalist rhetoric that we can see in the narrative and in the predominant themes. And this work is neither writing back to the canon or empire, nor is it asserting the post-colonial nation in any form. And we can also find a number of comparisons with Conrad's characters, which also elevates Joshi as a writer to a different level altogether. Now, talking about Billy's decisions, he comes from a middle class background, as we know, and that also influences his academic and career choices. His relationship with family and friends, there is a way in which we can see the nature of these relationships and contrast to the tribal values and tribal culture, because predominantly Billy belongs to a middle class affluent background. So the foil against which Billy's decisions are being set, that could be seen as problematic. Perhaps when we discuss the novel, we can get into some of those aspects as well. And about the idea of marriage and how Billy is unable to honor the commitments that he made as part of this marital relation, and the other women who are part of Billy's life, his passionate involvement, especially with Vilasia, the tribal woman, and underlying all of this, Billy's alienation from the society. How do we begin to understand that? Is it a form of escape? Is Billy unable to stand the middle class mediocrity and hypocrisy? Or is it just about the kind of many choices that he can afford to have? We may not have easy answers to this, but I also leave some of these questions for you to discuss. Are these choices available to everyone across class, caste, gender and region? Imagine a protagonist like Billy Biswas, and what if Billy Biswas were a Dalit or a woman? If you remember the discussions that we had as part of Cry the Peacock, we also realized that there is again a female protagonist who is caught in the middle class hypocrisy and mediocrity and the middle class value system, and unable to express herself as an individual, but the choice of running away, which is what eventually Billy Biswas does. This choice of running away and finding finding the right kind of passion, finding the right kind of place that one needs to be. Are these choices available to everyone? We find that this unfortunately is not a luxury that many can afford. One is not really negating the dilemma and the difficulty that Billy Biswas went through, but just trying to question the selfhood which is attributed to Billy Biswas in the context of the novel. And finally, what's the role of the post-colonial nation in the lives of individuals such as Billy, who are discontent with everything that the modern nation signifies and promotes? We are unable to accept Billy Biswas for what he is, but we are not in a position to entirely negate what he proposes to do and say and indicate either. So this is perhaps a post-colonial dilemma that we are also caught within. As we begin to wrap up this session, I hope you already have a sense of the frameworks within which this novel is situated. I strongly encourage you to read the novel on your own before you listen to a presentation by one of our students. She will be talking to us in detail about some of the aspects of the novel and how the novel can be situated in the larger framework of Indian fiction in English. She will be talking about a couple of major themes which are part of the novel and giving us a sense of the many critical approaches which have been followed up to understand and appreciate the novel in an academic framework.
Good morning everyone. So today we will be doing about the novel The Strange Case of Billy Biswas by Arun Joshi. So I will be taking you through the objectives of my presentation. So firstly, I will be giving you a biographical sketch about the author, then we will try to locate the author within the larger framework of Indian fiction in English, and then we will give a brief idea of the major themes that go on through the novel. Arun Joshi was born in 1939 in Varanasi. So he belonged to a family of scholars and he had completed his higher education in Kansas University and MIT, and it is important for us to note that he had this diasporic experience which played a really important role in forming his characters. And he had held a position of executive director in 1965, Sri Ram Center for Industrial Relations and Human Resources, Delhi. And he was actually, sadly he died very early in 1993. If you look at his literary output, it is very small as in compared to the other authors of his time. His literary output was very small. So if you notice his novels, there are only 5 novels which span his literary career. So you have The Foreigner, it is his first novel which he had written in 1968, and then of course you have our novel The Strange Case of Billy Biswas in 1971, and his last novel was The Last Labyrinth. It won a Sahitya Academy Award in 1982. So if I have to talk about this novel in a single sentence, I would like to say that it is the quest of an individual making sense of himself within the complicated web of modernity and tradition, if I have to put it in a sentence. And I will be talking about the plot through 3 important storylines which are important for us to understand the novel as a whole. So the character of Billy Biswas, of course it is the heart of the novel, and I am going to talk about his professional life and his personal relationships which he shares with the women of his life, Tuala Lindgren, Meena Chatterjee, Reema Kaul and Bilasia. So if you notice right from the start, we have this, Billy is presented to be a kind of an unconventional individual who is located in his life. Be it his professional choices where he had chose anthropology instead of going for a major kind of accepted thing like engineering, and he defies his father and he comes to US to do anthropology. And when it comes to his personal relationships, throughout the relationships we can see the kind of changes which happen within his character. So if you notice Tuala Lindgren, here he is kind of like this person who is really, his friendship with Tuala is based on this idea that he is interested in, both are really interested to know about the primitive life of the world. And when it comes to Meena Chatterjee, you can find Billy becoming really desperate to fit into the society. So that's when he marries Meena. And I think the relationship with Meena doesn't really last long and he starts feeling desperate. And then he gets into an affair with Reema Kaul, and that's when he starts realizing that he's becoming some kind of an inhuman person and he's undergoing this disintegration as an individual. And finally we can see that he has an happy ending with Bilasia, but of course that doesn't last long because he's unfortunately killed in the end. And so second theme I would like to talk about is his friendship with Bimal and Romesh Sahai. So you can see Romesh Sahai is our narrator of the story, and that was really interesting because the title is The Strange Case of Billy Biswas, but we have major portion of Billy being like told to us by Romesh. And the friendship between Romesh and Billy is really different because they both are really different as individuals, because Billy is this person who doesn't fit into the society and is quite suffering, and you can see his suffering very prominently. But when it comes to Romesh, he is actually located within the social structures. So he is married and he is into doing a particular job and he is following all the conventions, but still he can understand what Billy is going through. And I really feel that this kind of relationship is what takes the novel much forward. You can see their conversations are really heartfelt. And then you have the other theme, of course, the metamorphosis of Billy Biswas, which is what the whole plot is about. So right from the first place, from being alienated to the path of self-discovery, you can see that Billy's character undergoes a really dimensional change which goes throughout the novel. So how do we locate Arun Joshi within the larger framework of Indian fiction in English? So as I have come across through, when I read the material, you notice that his name is being just passed by. I mean, he's mentioned and his works are just noted down there, but I don't think there are much critical discussion happening about him. And now I would like to talk about the kind of historical context in which the novel came about. So it started about in 20th century, age of industrialization and technological development. So here of course man is reduced to this state of being mechanized sort of an individual. And simultaneously we also observe that several cross-cultural interactions are happening, which leads to a kind of a trans-cultural individual, and he is very rootless and alienated. That is, it becomes difficult for an individual to make sense of himself within the world. And of course Arun Joshi becomes important here because he is, I think, one of the first authors to give a fictive form to the inner chaos of self, and that he does it very effectively, and it is very directly implied from his work that he is trying to observe the kind of psychological changes in human beings. And if you are talking about his themes, even let it be his cultural conflict or lack of identity and anxiousness and all that are really relevant in today's time even. But then why do you think that he is not much discussed? I am going to look at the publishing house and the visibility in the international market. So first of all, this is a very common problem which is seen, that is difficulty with regard to the availability of the novels. They are pretty out of print, and of course you do not even get a Kindle version of his works. And then looking at the publishing history, it is noticed that it is highly confined to local publishers. Orient Paperbacks is the copy of which I have of the book. So, and also this is because of the, maybe it is because of the personality of the author, because he is tend to having nationalist inclinations, because in a letter written to Mr. Duva dated September 3rd, 1971, so he talks about this, that I can't imagine a foreign publishing firm being interested in my type of writing. Even if they were, I am not sure I would want to give it to them. I guess it would hurt my national pride. And along with it, even his personal sort of, his personality itself is very, he is a recluse and he is isolated, and he prefers to be, he is an introvert, and it's said that he even doesn't like his neighbors to know that he writes. So I am going to talk about some of the major themes which are present in the novel. So firstly I will talk about the theme of identity. And right at the beginning of the novel you have this line number 41 of Matthew Arnold's work, it irked him to be there, he could not rest. And I think that is how the novel starts. I mean it's and also like this theme of identity is something which runs very consistently throughout the novel, because you can see him trying to make sense of what he is. And of course, as we have already said, the historical context, there is a cultural colonialization and shrinking of the world, and man simultaneously has this problem of making sense of himself. And of course, what K.R. Srinivas Iyengar refers to this Indo-English writer to be this confused wanderer between the two worlds being the West and the East. And identity crisis and form of rootlessness, alienation in the character sketch of Billy. So I am going to talk about a particular paragraph. So this is a letter to his friend Tuala. So he kind of writes the kind of anxiousness which he feels, or the kind of loneliness which he feels when he is with everyone. So he writes this: "It seems, my dear Tuala, that there are certain questions popping up from the deep layers of my mind. Who am I? Who are my friends, my wife, my child? At times I look at them sitting at the dining table, and for a passing moment I cannot decide who they are or what accident of creation has brought us together." So every time he keeps wondering about like why he is there in this particular world. So that theme is something which consistently runs throughout the novel. And philosophy, yeah, the work is pretty much rich in philosophy if you look at it from that aspect, and it's influenced by two major kind of philosophical systems, the Western and the Indian. So you can see Billy as this kind of Buddha who leaves his family and he leaves his like his earthly bonds, and then goes to a kind of a different life to attain salvation. And of course dharma. So here the sentence is really interesting. He tells that I have greater duties towards my soul rather than anything else. Unlike what you see in case of the other kind of works which we have seen so far, it was more oriented towards the national identity or kind of like this collective identity. So here you see Billy drifting apart from this sort of a narrative, and you can see him assume a kind of an individualistic mode of identity making. So psychologically, yeah, it is very influenced by Freud, and if you notice, the technique of self-introspection and theme of individual consciousness becomes very important in the particular novel, and especially it gives you an insight into a mind of a modern middle class man and what kind of anxieties or what kind of problems that he is actually facing by. And this is very different from the narratives which we have seen previously, because they were more about individuals who were located within a national narrative and what were the problems which are faced by them. So here we have this new shift which is talking about middle class men. I'll read out a paragraph from the novel. So it kind of shows you how much the character is self-analytical. This is what Billy narrates to Romy about his affair with Rima, and you can see that how much he is aware of what he is doing. The worst of it was that in spite of this knowledge of my degradation, I continued to behave as before. I continued to whine and lie and sham. I found that I could not stop. I met her 3 or 4 times after that. Each time I would determine to be honest with her, with myself, and each time I would start to play the part as soon as I got the chance. You have no idea how ridiculous, fraudulent it became. I offered to divorce Meena and marry her, even though Rima herself never hinted at such a thing. So he is aware of the fact that he is doing something, you know, like abnormal. At the same time, he is very reflexive of what he is doing. There is a theme of madness which runs within the novel. It is very amusing to read that Billy really finds, madness to, like, he really works with the, like, Billy works with in a mental hospital, and he interacts with the people who suffer from madness, and this is very similar to what Arun Joshi life was, because he too worked in a mental hospital where his uncle was a psychiatrist, and the theme of madness was discussed in such a way that you can find Billy telling that I find them to be the most amusing people to talk with. I mean, he tells that he is really comfortable talking with mad people, and that is something which is really different. And all these problems, whether be it psychological or philosophical, the kind of changes in the characters happen primarily because of this civilized and primitive kind of interactions which are happening in 20th century. So it is presented to us as 2 different worlds, and they split across. I mean, in geographical space you can see that there is a discussion of Black Harlem area and Manhattan area, and when it comes to the second part of the novel, you can see Delhi and Maikala hills of where the tribals live. So there is a split between the primitive and the civilized, which is always maintained throughout the novel. And in case of psychological space, is also quite split. On one hand you have this unconscious realm, and on the other hand you have this rationality which is predominantly, there in the novel. It's shown as the other side. And there's an intense critical, it's very critical of modernity and rationality and the upper class lifestyle. And it is said to be that the upper class lifestyle is something which is hypocritical and which is artificial, and you find that resonating at every part of the book, be it talking about Bilasia and talking about Meena Chatterjee. You can find that difference clearly, where Meena is shown to be this hypocritical and artificial, and she is very boring in nature. But when it comes to Bilasia, you can find her to be this mysterious person and who just makes the life beautiful. And then you have this account of the primitive idea. Right from the beginning of the novel, you can find themes such as music, dance, and all the other things associated with this traditional kind of a life is shown to be really exciting, and the experience is kind of described in such a way that you actually feel that there is some kind of magic around it. And then you have this element of supernaturalism which runs throughout the novel. So there is this one incident in the particular novel that you have Billy defending a Krishna murder case. It is a child sacrifice case, and you can see him tell that of course there are laws of the other world. Even though being a modern individual and educated abroad, he still believes in this idea of the other world. And then magic, of course Billy is elevated to this kind of a magical healer when he goes back to the tribal area, and he is seen to have this mysterious healing powers. When it comes to the political context on a national level, quite less is discussed. I mean, if you look at it from a whole view, you talk about, at one point of the novel, they just discuss about the recent events, and it comes by in passing that we understand that it was set in a time period after Nehru's demise. And moreover than that, I don't think that anything of national level is particularly discussed in the novel. And when it comes to social context, yeah, it becomes a bit relevant because you are talking about conflicts that are at the local level between political authorities and locals. And it is significant from the perspective of development, according to a paper by Solé. So he talks about the fact that this is an era of post-independence. The novel came after independence, and that was when there were strong, unchallenged notions of modern development, and like there was displacement of tribal people and like all other phenomena. The novel becomes important in the sense that it brings about a focus on the tribal. So this was unlike the kind of the dominant kind of events that were happening. So this brings into this idea of the tribals, the lifestyle, and the kind of conflicts which they undergo. So, I am going to talk about the Orientalist tendencies within the novel, and this is really interesting to find out that though Arun Joshi talks about, you know, like the existential theme, the idea of modern man being anxious and all, and you see that it is very universal in nature if you look at it from that point of view. But then however, the path which Arun Joshi develops in order to resolve this conflict is predominantly Hinduism and predominantly associated with the Oriental knowledge. So, this was very interesting because throughout the novel I had this feeling when I was reading it, because the East has a fascinating realm of the exotic, the mystical and the seductive. So, I think this kind of translated throughout the novel if you read about various descriptions of, you know, the dance or the moon rising, and it was described in this mysterious sort of a way. And even if you look at the way in which Bilasia was described, she was shown to be the sort of some mysterious woman, and like Billy suddenly undergoes this realization that she was all he was ever looking for. And so there is an invocation of the spiritual to, you know, separate India from the evils of modernity. And there is this monolithic tradition which is quite emphasized in the novel, and it is a bit problematic because post-colonial era you have multiple identities and monolithic kind of an understanding of a tradition is not possible. And then you have this culture, if it's so, and it is represented, if a particular culture comes into the scene, it is represented by a kind of dominant people or dominant section is what is said to be, you know, representing this particular culture. And this idea of pre-colonial Indian culture as pristine and pure. So, when you read about the tribals, you really feel that at one point of time he talks about them being happy irrespective of whatever happens, drink wine and women, and like they are really, you know, happy and self-satisfied in their own world. So, this kind of a very you know, closed kind of a structure is emphasized when it talks about the tribals. And primitive versus civilized is, of course, throughout the novel you can see that there is a clear distinction. So, Black Harlem, and you have Manhattan area, or you have supernatural and you have rationalism. So, I think it does reinforce a sort of cultural stereotypes again in a different sort of way. That is it, thank you.
So, with this we wind up today's lecture. I thank you for listening and I look forward to seeing you in the next session.